Look at this. Millions of people across the country marching as we speak against the policies of President Trump. This is Boston. Look at that.
On the morning of October 18th, 2025, the streets of America awakened to a sea of yellow. From dawn in New York to dusk in Los Angeles, millions of people stepped out of their homes to take part in what would become one of the largest protest movements in modern American history. They carried homemade signs, waved flags, and sang old revolutionary songs beneath banners that read, "No Kings." To an observer, it was a sight that blended defiance with hope, a reminder that democracy, when threatened, can still stir millions to act. What began as an idea shared in the corners of the internet had erupted into a nationwide demonstration that would echo around the world. Unlike many modern protests that rally behind a single leader or cause, this movement was defined by an absence of both. There was no official party, no central spokesperson, and no corporate funding. What united people was a shared unease, a belief that power was becoming too concentrated in the hands of one man and one administration. The words "no king" carried a symbolic weight that transcended political divisions. For some, it was a protest against President Donald Trump's second-term policies. For others, it was a reaffirmation of the nation's founding promise, that no person, no matter how powerful, stands above the Constitution. Across every state, the message took on a character of its own. In Washington, D.C., a vast human chain formed around the National Mall, stretching from the Lincoln Memorial to the Capitol steps. In small towns across the Midwest, farmers parked tractors along rural highways with yellow ribbons tied to their antennas. On the West Coast, students painted murals of broken crowns and open hands. The yellow color, chosen deliberately, symbolized vigilance, a watchful eye on power. Organizers described it as sunlight, the color of exposure, meant to illuminate the shadows where democracy can decay unseen. The protests did not appear out of nowhere. They were the culmination of months of political escalation and years of growing division. Since returning to office in January 2025, Trump's administration had introduced a series of controversial executive orders expanding federal policing authority, limiting demonstrations near government buildings, and increasing penalties for what officials called civil disruptions. Critics argued that these measures blurred the boundary between civil administration and militarized control. Supporters, however, saw them as necessary steps to restore order in what they viewed as a chaotic political landscape. The country once again found itself split along familiar lines: liberty versus security, dissent versus loyalty. It was in that environment that a simple hashtag first appeared: No Kings. It was posted by a college student in Boston in early 2024, reacting to a news story about presidential immunity. The phrase quickly struck a nerve. Within days, it spread across social media platforms, gaining traction among journalists, veterans, and civic groups alarmed by the government's rhetoric. Online discussions turned into community groups, and those groups began organizing teach-ins and digital town halls about the erosion of checks and balances. What began as a meme had transformed into a message, and soon, into a movement. The early organizers emphasized nonviolence and historical symbolism. Their website, nokings.org, included links to de-escalation training, protest safety guidelines, and digital security briefings. They wanted the movement to be peaceful but powerful, an echo of the civil rights marches of the 1960s. Many even studied historical protest footage to learn how to maintain composure in tense situations. Their strategy was simple: occupy space, remain peaceful, and remind the world that democracy depends on restraint, not fear. By the fall of 2025, they had achieved what few modern grassroots movements had: mass participation without chaos. Still, the movement's rise was not without tragedy. In June 2025, a rally in Salt Lake City turned violent after a confrontation between protesters and far-right countergroups. One person was killed and several were injured. The event shook the movement to its core. Organizers temporarily suspended large gatherings and called for a pause for reflection. But rather than extinguish the cause, the tragedy deepened it. Vigils were held in dozens of cities, candles forming the words, "No Kings," across public parks. The victim's name became a rallying cry, a symbol of sacrifice for a cause larger than politics. By October, the movement had become impossible to ignore. News outlets estimated more than 2,600 protest locations across the United States, each linked through live streams and social media broadcasts. Drone footage captured seas of yellow winding through city centers from Denver to Miami, Seattle to New Orleans. Local organizers coordinated speeches, musical performances, and moments of silence. At precisely noon Eastern Time, participants nationwide chanted in unison, "No crowns, no kings, we the people." It was a moment that seemed to transcend the digital age, raw, human, and unfiltered. In Washington, the White House released a brief statement calling the demonstrations an organized attempt to undermine stability. State-friendly media channels echoed the sentiment, accusing protesters of spreading misinformation and foreign propaganda. But other outlets, including major independent networks, painted a different picture. Citizens exercising their constitutional rights in a show of civic unity. The contrast between official rhetoric and on-the-ground reporting became a story of its own. For many, it revealed the widening rift between the government and the governed, a narrative that would only deepen in the days that followed. In the heart of New York City, Times Square transformed into a massive stage. Speakers read excerpts from the Federalist Papers. Actors reenacted moments from the Constitutional Convention, drawing cheers from the crowd. The atmosphere was both celebratory and solemn, filled with the hum of collective awareness, that rare sense of being part of something historically significant. In Los Angeles, artists painted over freeway walls with murals of open eyes, symbolizing vigilance. In Philadelphia, a crowd gathered before Independence Hall and sang "America the Beautiful," replacing one line with the words, "Crown no king but freedom." Despite the movement's peaceful nature, some feared it could turn volatile. Police departments nationwide braced for potential unrest, deploying extra officers in major metropolitan areas. Yet, by evening, reports showed that most protests remained orderly. A handful of minor scuffles were recorded, mostly sparked by counter-protesters or agitators. But in city after city, officers found themselves standing alongside demonstrators rather than against them. In several locations, police chiefs publicly thanked organizers for their cooperation, an image that stood in stark contrast to the unrest that had defined earlier protest eras. Outside the United States, the movement's imagery began spreading rapidly. In London, Paris, and Sydney, solidarity marches appeared, small in number, but powerful in message. Protesters carried the same yellow banners, with translations of "No Kings" written in multiple languages. Political commentators abroad described the American demonstrations as part of a broader global anxiety, a fear that democratic norms were eroding across the world. It isn't just about one president, a speaker in Berlin said. It's about the idea that power, once concentrated, rarely gives itself back. Historians were quick to frame the movement in a larger context. Many compared it to the protests of the 1960s and 70s, or even further back, to the populist revolts of the 19th century and the anti-imperial sentiment that fueled America's own revolution. They noted how every few generations, the nation undergoes a reckoning with authority. The No Kings protests, they argued, were not an anomaly, but part of a repeating cycle, an inevitable reaction to the tension between freedom and control. What made 2025 unique was the speed at which it had formed, fueled by technology, but rooted in timeless ideals. As night fell on October 18th, drone footage captured a country illuminated not by flames or chaos, but by cell phones held high, small lights flickering across parks, bridges, and city streets. People sang, some prayed, others simply stood in silence. It was a collective exhale after years of tension. In a time defined by division, millions had found common ground in a single ancient principle, that the power of the people must never yield to the crown of one. As dawn broke on October 19, 2025, America woke to an image that was already being called historic. News networks replayed drone footage of glowing crowds stretching across city skylines, while newspapers ran front-page headlines declaring, "A nation speaks." For a brief moment, the protests overshadowed the political noise that had consumed the country for years. Even some of the president's critics admitted that such a vast, organized, and peaceful demonstration was something rare in the 21st century, an act of unity in an age of division. Across social media, the phrase "No Kings" had reached billions of impressions in less than 24 hours, surpassing even the largest online movements of the past decade. In the days that followed, the government's response became the subject of intense debate. The president released a short, televised address calling the demonstrations misguided but lawful, while insisting that the strength of America lies in its ability to tolerate disagreement. Yet behind the scenes, reports emerged of federal agencies monitoring protest leaders and reviewing their digital communications. Civil liberties groups immediately filed lawsuits, accusing the administration of surveillance overreach. Congressional hearings were requested, but most committee sessions were delayed, reflecting a Congress still sharply divided along partisan lines. The mainstream press portrayed the movement as a wake-up call, not just for politicians, but for the public itself. Editorials compared it to the Women's March of 2017 and the March on Washington in 1963, arguing that democratic protest was the country's oldest form of accountability. Others warned that such unity could fade as quickly as it appeared, lost amid media cycles and political spin. Yet on university campuses, in churches, and online forums, the phrase "No Kings" began taking on a second life. Not just a protest slogan, but a civic mantra. It appeared on posters, t-shirts, and even classroom whiteboards, beside quotes from Thomas Paine and Frederick Douglass. The cultural ripple spread quickly. Artists painted murals of yellow crowns dissolving into sunlight. Musicians released songs inspired by the chants heard during the marches. Independent filmmakers began collecting footage from across the country to produce documentaries and digital archives. Even brands, cautiously at first, joined in, promoting democracy drives and voter registration campaigns under the same banner. To many observers, it marked a subtle but profound shift. For the first time in years, the language of democracy had become fashionable again. Meanwhile, opposition voices continued to push back. Supporters of the administration accused the movement of hypocrisy, arguing that it exaggerated the threat of authoritarianism and sought to delegitimize an elected government. Right-wing commentators on television and radio branded the demonstrations as elitist theater, a performance by urban liberals disconnected from ordinary Americans. Yet polling conducted a week later told a different story. Nearly 64% of respondents said they supported the protesters' right to march, and over half agreed with their central message, that no leader should possess unchecked power. The global reaction was just as striking. In cities from London to São Paulo, people gathered in solidarity, holding small vigils and waving yellow cloths. Foreign governments released cautious statements praising the resilience of American civil society. In countries struggling with their own democratic challenges, the protests became a reference point, a reminder that even in moments of decline, public resistance can restore faith in civic principles. Some international newspapers described it as America's democratic reset, a phrase that would later headline editorials across the world. Academics began dissecting the movement almost immediately. Political theorists described it as an example of decentralized resistance, a new kind of activism made possible by the digital age. Unlike traditional movements that relied on leaders or parties, No Kings was driven by networks, fluid, adaptive, and resistant to infiltration. Analysts noted how organizers used encrypted channels, real-time mapping, and decentralized funding to coordinate thousands of simultaneous gatherings with minimal conflict. It was, in many ways, a 21st century version of the pamphlet revolution that had fueled America's independence centuries earlier. But the protests also exposed deep fractures. While millions had united for one day, the underlying social divisions remained. Some conservative communities saw the event as an attack on patriotism, while others viewed it as a sign of renewal. Within progressive circles, debates emerged about the next step. Should No Kings evolve into a political coalition or remain a civic movement without hierarchy? Organizers themselves insisted on the latter. If we create leaders, one founding member said, we create crowns, and crowns are what we stood against. In the weeks that followed, the tangible effects began to show. Several states proposed legislation protecting protest rights and limiting executive emergency powers. Universities added new courses on democratic resilience and civil responsibility. Nonprofit groups reported a surge in volunteer signups and donations to voting rights organizations. For a moment, it seemed that the spirit of October 18th had translated into concrete action. But history, as always, proved complex. Sustaining momentum would be harder than creating it. By late November, media coverage had largely shifted back to political disputes, economic debates, and election forecasts. Yet the imagery of yellow-clad crowds lingered in the public imagination. Footage from that day continued to circulate online, often set to music or historical narration. Some commentators began calling it the day America remembered itself. Others were more skeptical, arguing that symbolic protests rarely change systems. But even the skeptics conceded one thing: something had stirred, something larger than a single headline or speech. As 2026 approached, the movement settled into quieter forms of expression. Community teach-ins replaced mass marches. Online forums became discussion spaces for civic education. On the anniversary of the protest, thousands gathered again, not to shout, but to listen. They held signs quoting the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In their silence, the message was perhaps louder than before. The protests had evolved from a moment into a memory, and from a memory into a lesson. Historians looking back would later describe the No Kings movement as one of the most significant democratic demonstrations of the early 21st century. It had not toppled a government, nor rewritten laws overnight. But it had done something subtler and perhaps more lasting. It reminded citizens, weary, divided, and cynical, that their collective voice still mattered. It reintroduced the language of accountability into a culture saturated with noise. In a sense, it restored a moral vocabulary that had been fading from public life. The night of October 18th ended not with fireworks or violence, but with light. Across the nation, people raised their phones, flashlights, and candles toward the sky. From above, drones captured what looked like a constellation of human stars scattered across the continent. Each point of light was small, almost insignificant on its own. But together, they formed a vision of what democracy looks like when it's defended. Not by kings, not by rulers, but by ordinary people who refuse to forget who truly holds the crown.